All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the inaugural Stoplight Studio webinar. I'll start off things with a couple of line items. We'll be recording this video and sharing it after the webinar with folks. So if anybody's not able to attend on your team, or if you have to leave early, don't worry, we'll send out the link after the webinar. So a brief agenda before we get into things. This will be a demo-heavy webinar, so we'll get into the meat of it. But we'll start off with some introductions for the speakers in this webinar. We'll talk a bit about the history of Stoplight's API Designer and why we made some of the decisions that we did in building this latest iteration of our API Designer. We'll go into a demo on API design by designing a basic API. We'll go into the basics of linting and mocking, some docs and publishing, and then wrap it up with a brief look at our roadmap and Q&A from everybody on the call. If you do have questions, just pop it into the Q&A feature here in the webinar. It should be somewhere, I think, on the bottom of your screen. Just ask the questions in there, and then at the end of the video, or the hour, we will take a look at the questions and go through them. So a brief introduction to us. My name is Marc MacLeod. I'm the founder and CEO at Stoplight. My background is in API design and software engineering and product. I've been working with OpenAPI and Swagger for about 5-6 years now. So it's been quite a while. Back in the days when it was a kind of a trio of Swagger 1, Swagger 2, RAML, and Blueprint. And I'm joined on the call by Phil and Chris, and I'll let Phil introduce himself and then Chris.
Hello there. Name's Phil Sturgeon. I'm the architect here at Stoplight. I work on kind of making things, various different parts of our ecosystem talk to each other effectively, and kind of planning a lot of stuff. So I've also spent a lot of time on the linting and mocking tools, which I'll be demoing later.
Hey, I'm Chris Lott. I'm a software engineer here at Stoplight. I've been here for about 3.5 years, and I mainly work on building all of our docs products, and I've worked on helping to build Studio as well.
So if anybody's used Hubs or any of our previous designers, Chris has been kind of a significant hand in building those products, and obviously he's been also involved in helping to build Studio. And we'll be taking a look at many of these things today. So a quick on why we built Studio and where we've come from. So the first API designer that Stoplight put on the market was back in 2015, 2016. And our mission was to provide a more accessible way for folks to produce API designs, in particular around these emergent specifications, RAML at the time and Swagger 2. It was our belief that by making the creation of these designs more accessible, more companies could reap the benefits that come with having well-designed APIs in these specifications, like automatic mocking, automatic documentation, contract testing, collaboration and governance, all the things that you get when you're able to produce these designs. At the time, we realized it was pretty difficult for folks to get started. There was quite a learning curve. You had to become an OpenAPI, or at that time, a Swagger or RAML expert. And you had to write the specification line by line, which was pretty error-prone and pretty inefficient, particularly when these specifications got to be thousands or tens of thousands of lines long. So we built the first form-based designer back then, and it supported Swagger 2 and RAML. Fast forward a little bit, about a year, and we released version 2 of that designer, and it was rebuilt from the ground up to work directly with the underlying specification, at that time Swagger 2. So that it would preserve all the semantics in your specification, your X extensions and everything else. And it allowed you to switch back and forth between writing the specification directly, like you might do in a Swagger editor, and using our form-based designer, like you could do in the first iteration of the Stoplight API designer. And that was kind of a no-compromise approach to allow you to do things that UIs aren't good at, like copy and paste or bulk delete via the code-based design. And still use the form-based designer to get things done quickly without having to be an OpenAPI expert, or at that time, a Swagger expert. we realized in that iteration of the designer, there were a couple of shortcomings that led us on the path to Studio. The first was there were more and more of these specifications coming out onto the market. OpenAPI 3 was relatively new at the time. Now it's a bit more mature, but supporting multiple specifications and multiple formats. So OpenAPI 2, OpenAPI 3, JSON schema, YAML versus JSON, Markdown, all of these formats and specifications was quite difficult in the previous architecture. And we've solved that inside of Studio so that it's now easy for us to add new specifications and new formats. So you'll see better support for a wider variety of specifications more quickly after they become available in the industry. And so with Studio, we support JSON and YAML, OpenAPI 2 and OpenAPI 3, and Markdown and JSON schema. So that was a big change and kind of under the hood change to make it possible to support multiple specifications. And not just for the form-based editing, but also for the linting and validation framework and for the mocking, and then in 2020 for the contract testing. So there are quite a few areas that we need to support these specifications, not just in the code view, but read, forms, linting, validations, mocking, contract testing. So it's no small effort to add support for a new specification. And then the second big reason that we kind of re-architected how we approach API design is to integrate with existing workflows. So we realize that a lot of things happen in Git these days, whether it's GitHub, Bitbucket, or GitLab, or Gitea, or pick your own VCS. In particular, a lot of the collaboration and kind of governance flows around PRs, et cetera. And Git is a very good vehicle for storing these specifications. And so we re-architected Studio to work on the file system. So that's the desktop version of Studio that we'll show today. And it also works on the web version, on the web via a virtualized file system. And so we wanted to allow you to co-locate your specification files and your documentation in your own Git repositories alongside your own code, and take advantage of some of the more advanced features of API design, like splitting up your design into multiple files and splitting out the models into their own files, etc. So that required a lot of under the hood changes inside of Studio to work more like a traditional IDE, but while maintaining many of the features that made the previous versions of our designer great, like the form-based editing and the quick refactoring. So before I get into the demo on API design, we'll do a brief on why API design is important. You can think of it as, an analogy I like to often kind of point to is a blueprint, not the specification, but a blueprint for a house. So you wouldn't build a house without a blueprint. The blueprint is much quicker to iterate on and allows you to get with the constituents who are buying the house as an architect and collaborate on the design of that particular house and make changes before you actually go and build it. And those changes are much less expensive to do because it's just a blueprint. And then when everyone decides on what that blueprint looks like, you can go ahead and build the house. And so, in the case of API design, these specification documents, so, your OpenAPI files, your JSON schema files, act as essentially your blueprints or your contract that will then turn into the implemented API once all the various constituents and consumers have agreed that this is It's important to get others involved, not just the developers who will be building it, but the front-end developers who might be building a mobile app that consumes that API, or your customers or clients who ultimately consume that API, or if you have a governance board or a center of excellence or anything else at the organization, a set of API architects that review the quality of your APIs, this is their kind of unit, their point at which they would get involved and give feedback before the actual implementation phase of that API begins. It also allows you to do stuff like set up mock servers, which Phil will talk to briefly, so that your consumers can start using the API before it's built, and you kind of parallelize development a bit. And generally, it can speed up development, increase consistency, and increase visibility of the APIs within your organization. So for this demo, we'll take a quick look at designing a pretty basic API. We don't have a lot of time here, and we want to get through basically 3 demos. So we'll do a quick design of a to-dos API. And we'll look at some of the features of Studio and what sets it apart from other solutions in the market and our own solutions that we have built in the past. So I will go ahead and change my screen here. All right. So I'm here in the desktop version of Stoplight Studio. It's available for OS X, Windows, and Linux. There's also a web version that Chris will show at the end in the third demo. But for the purposes of this one, I'll be working in the desktop version. You can download this at stoplight.io/studio. And I'm going to start by opening up a code repository, actually, that I already have on my computer, but that does not yet have a design. So I just want to show how you can co-locate your designs with your code, because that's an important and distinguishing feature of Stoplight Studio from our previous products and from most other products in the market. So I could clone a repository or start a new project, but I'm going to go ahead and just open up a folder on my computer, this Stoplight To-Dos folder. And here we are in the project view, and we don't have any APIs defined in this project yet. But if we go over to the Files tab, you'll note there's all sorts of other files in here that are not really relevant to design. These are the actual implementation files, so the Ruby files, etc., that make up this API. So this is just demonstrating that you can co-locate your API design files with it's still on the project selection page in the webinar. Let's see here.
Yeah, maybe turn off screen sharing and turn it back on again. It seems to be stuck on the open.
Interesting. All right, let's try it again. So I just turned it off and I turned it on.
Yeah, there we go.
See a different screen now? Is it going to change though, Phil? So if I change tabs here, is it showing the tab change?
Oh, I hope so. No, you are not changing tabs. This must be some Zoom issue.
Huh. All righty. Well, that's no good. Let's go ahead.
Are you sharing your entire desktop, or are you sharing like the one window?
I can try the whole desktop. Let me just try the whole desktop. Okay, so there's the whole desktop. Phil, can you see me changing to files?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, all right. So essentially what I did, let me go back to the project screen, is I opened a folder, this to-dos folder. It's just on my computer, and it is a project that already has a bunch of code files in it, so Ruby, et cetera, that make up the actual implementation of the API. But this is just to demonstrate that you can co-locate and mix in your JSON schema files, your OpenAPI files, your Markdown files inside of Studio with the actual implementation so that they live together if you so choose. You can, of course, still create a separate project just for your design files if you want, but this gives you the option and you can make the choice that's best for your organization. So what we'll be doing here is designing, creating an OpenAPI file or an OpenAPI design document for this to-dos API. And we'll start by clicking the plus button up here and clicking the Add API button. And there are a bunch of options. You can do OpenAPI v3, v2, YAML, or JSON. It defaults to YAML OpenAPI v3 because that's just the latest and greatest. But if your organization is mandating other formats, you can certainly, or other versions of the specification, you can certainly choose those. You can also import an existing OpenAPI file if you already have one somewhere else on your computer. So we'll start with a blank one, and we'll just call it to-dos API. And you start, as you can see, with a form-based view in the middle, and on the right, we have the underlying OpenAPI document. It's very bare right now, but I'll leave the code view open so that we can see it being built up as we work here in the form view. You can work in either spot, so this is kind of a no compromise approach. If you have folks at your organization that prefer to write OpenAPI by hand, they can certainly just maximize this and work directly in the specification file on the code itself. Or if you have folks that don't really know OpenAPI as well or prefer to work in a form-based editor, they can use the form-based editing options right here. So we'll start by adding, we'll remove this because this is not where the API actually lives, and we'll instead add a host for where it actually lives. And we'll call it prod, something like that. And there's a security scheme. So security schemes are an OpenAPI feature that basically just allow you to describe how your API is secured. And in the case of this particular to-dos API, we'll be using an API key authentication, and it will be a property called API key that is in the query string of requests. So I'll just make sure these settings are set, and we'll name it just API key as a security scheme. I won't get into the contact or license. This is fairly self-explanatory. So now we have the basic kind of high-level settings for this API, where it lives and how it's secured. I'll put in a brief description. And this is Markdown, so you can go ahead and put Markdown in here. And we'll start by now defining the first endpoints, or operations, as they're sometimes called, in our API. So I'll go ahead up here at the plus again and click plus endpoint. And we'll be adding it to the to-dos API. So you can define multiple API design or OpenAPI files in a single project. So if you have microservices, or you're otherwise just breaking up your API design into smaller pieces, maybe a API design file just for user management, one for payments, etc. You can certainly do that and define multiple separate API files and work with them in the same project within Studio. So in this case, we're working at the to-dos API, and we will create a path for /todos. And the get operation here will simply return a list of to-dos. So this is a pretty common convention in a CRUD or RESTful application, where the plural path returns a list of the thing that it is describing. So in this case, a list of to-dos. Also common in a RESTful API is that post to that same plural path, the post method will create that resource. So this would be create to-do. And we'll start with just those two operations, and we'll add a couple more while we're at it. So we'll just do create and add more. And we'll choose the to-dos API here and do a to-dos. But in this case, we're going to be working with a particular to-do. So this notation here with the little brackets, you can do this after the fact, and I'll show that. But if you happen to know it, this is essentially a parameter. So this is saying, there will be some sort of value here, the ID for the to-do in this case. So the get will be getting us a specific to-do. Again, this is a RESTful convention. So get to-do. The put will usually update. So this will be update to-do. And then we'll add one more for delete, which would be remove to-do. So essentially, you can specify the ID of a to-do to get that specific one, to update that specific one, or to remove that specific to-do. And I'll go ahead and click create. And we can see now on the left that we have a number of operations or endpoints, and attached to several paths. So we have our /to-dos path with two operations, get and post. So you can see these two defined. If we wanted to add another one, say head, and go ahead and click the head tab here and click add head operation to just quickly add another method to this /to-dos path. But we won't do that right now because that's not actually in this API. And instead, we'll just start with the get operation for a specific to-do. Under the hood, so I'll switch back to the right view so we can see what's going on here. Under the hood, we can see that the path params have been added for us. So it's defined this to-do ID. In the actual OpenAPI specification, this is stuff that you would all have to do on your own. Make sure that if there is a path param here, it is added in the actual specification. This is a common mistake, omitting this. But if you use the form-based design stuff, this will all be added for you. Okay, so go ahead and look at the files. We can see the OpenAPI.yaml file has been added to our project in this reference folder. We'll get to roadmap in a little bit, but in general, we will be relaxing the constraint that you have to organize into this reference folder. For now, the design files need to be in a reference folder in order for them to show up in the API's list. This will just happen naturally if you use the tools themselves. So I just went ahead and saved that file to disk. You can, of course, open up this file in another editor if you prefer, like VS Code, or use any other tools on your computer to work with these files since they're just, again, on your file system. I'll go ahead and refresh to see if that takes care of that bug. There we go. So yes, there's probably already a bug submitted for that little local host thing for whoever shared that in the chat. But we'll get to kind of resources, so roadmap and where the issues are being tracked in the slide at the end of the webinar. So we have our to-dos path set here and our method. And now we're going to go ahead and add a response. So this essentially should respond with a to-dos object. So I'll click plus and get a 200 here, which is what we want. And I'm going to add a body. And I'm going to go ahead and just define it inline here. So let's say it has an ID, a name, completed, and a completed at, I believe. And so if we look, we can see that the JSON schema is being created here as we create it in the form. And we'll go ahead and say completed is probably a Boolean, not a string, and that ID is required and name is required. We'll just put those two in there. So again, you can write this yourself by hand, or you can work here in the form-based editor. Once you get the hang of the form-based editor, it is much, much more efficient than writing it by hand. If I were going through this not at webinar speed, I could produce hundreds of lines of OpenAPI in a matter of 10 minutes using the form-based design stuff. So we've defined our response here, ID, name, completed, and completed at. We can do a quick sanity check if we switch over to the read view and go to try it and put in something here. I actually don't know a real ID, so let's just go to to-dos first and grab one of these guys and go there. It is in our roadmap to do a one-click turn this actual API response into OpenAPI and JSON schema. We'll get to that at the very end, but this is pretty close. I'm just going to leave it here for the purposes of the demo. It's missing a couple of properties, but we'll leave it as is for right now. So I'll switch back over to the right view. The next thing we would want to do is do the same thing for put, because put probably responds with that same object. So we'll go ahead and add a response, add a body, and I could define it again here, but instead of doing that, let's go ahead and pull it out to a separate model so that we can reuse it. So instead of going ahead and adding 4 properties here and just duplicating what I just did over here in the get, I'm going to pull these out. Again, a roadmap feature to right-click refactor this into a model, but for now I'll do it manually. I'll just go ahead and click a new model. You can either do it inside of the OpenAPI file itself or as a separate file, which I'm going to do right now. So we'll call this a to-do. And we'll go ahead and add those properties. So that was a name, completed, and completed at. And we'll make this Boolean, and we'll make this required. So again, under the hood, this is just JSON schema. And if we look at files, or down here, you can also see the breadcrumbs. This is just a separate file inside of our project. The reason to do it as a separate file instead of embedded in the OpenAPI file is that these JSON schemas can actually be really useful for a variety of other purposes, from validating requests and responses in your own API, to validating queues and events, to generating documentation, or reusing it across multiple APIs instead of just within one API. And so I'll go ahead and refactor this so that instead of defining it in here, we'll use a reference to that to-do model that we just created. So this is now a reference, as you can see, to that file. And if we look under the hood at the read view, and you can see it looks almost exactly the same. It's dereferencing it so that we're now able to reuse this ref across all of our responses. So I'll go ahead and use it here as well. And then delete, likely returns a 204, no content. And so we'll just set it to that 204 and not add a body in this particular case. All right, in the interest of time, because I don't want to take everything up here, I guess I will actually stop there. We would continue with the to-dos and make this an array. Those references, right? So it returns a list of to-do objects. We would add request bodies. We would secure things like post with that security API key. And we would continue on kind of fleshing out this API. There are also some advanced concepts around using all of and combinators to reuse more of these models. But we'll save that for a more advanced webinar down the road as we continue to flesh out the features of Studio. So with that, I will stop sharing here, head back over to the slides, and hand it over to Phil to talk briefly about why linting and mocking is cool, and give a brief demo of some of the linting and mocking features inside of Studio.
All right, hello there. How is my screen share doing?
You're all set.
Fantastic. So this is a different demo from To Do. I've got a Adyen, a payment provider. They open source their stuff, so I figure it'd be quite nice to work with a fairly realistic specification. So I wonder if I can get rid of this. Yeah, probably fine. So just opening it up, they've got a couple of different APIs here. Got a few different things, and if we go into payment methods, just open up one of the operations, we can start to see there's quite a lot of complaints coming in from Spectral. So Spectral is actually looking for quite a few things. It's the name of our it's the name of our linting tool, which does basic validation, but it can also then start to get a bit more opinionated than that, right? Like, you don't just want to know that your stuff is technically valid, you want to know that it's actually useful and good. And good kind of varies based on different companies' priorities. So you can create your own custom rule sets for stuff like that. But out of the box, we have a bunch of things, and it's like, you can't put anything next to ref, which is actually in the specification, but some tools support it and some don't. So you get super inconsistent experiences. Let's just look at the raw view for now. So yeah, here we have a ref, and there's a description there, which shouldn't really be there. So you can go through and delete all of those, but maybe you're okay with this because your tooling kind of supports it and whatever else. And maybe, you know, there's a lot of complaints about non-empty tags arrays, like you should really have tags for your things like this. But maybe you don't have time to work on all those things right now. So what we're going to do is customize Spectral. We can do that just by making a new file. We're going to add a nice little shiny button for this, but this support was only added fairly recently, so it's a little new. You make a .spectral.yaml file, and gives you a little example of what it should look like by default. So when you don't have any rules, you start off, you need to create something. And basically, yeah, you know what, let's do the YAML version. You want to extend from something, and by default, there's some rules I mentioned. That's an array. So these are all the rules, and you can turn some things off, and that's what it's showing us here. It's saying you probably don't want to turn OAS2 schema off. That's a fairly important rule, but let's just do this for a moment and see what it says. So you get a preview of all the rules that exist. And when you do this, what you do is you get in a recommended subset, which is not all of the rules, just the ones that we think are important. So it's essentially the same as writing this. It takes a second to upload sometimes. If you save, it should trigger it. Or no,
Recommended.
Recommend. Thanks. Talking and typing is not my strong suit. So here you get recommended ones. That's the same as the short version, or you can do all, and there's a bunch of rules that will come in. And so if you do all, this is kind of like strict mode. There's a lot of things, and you might find yourself with a lot of complaints being mentioned. So if we go back to the API view and look at one of these methods, it's probably going to be even more. Yeah, we've still got all these ref complaints, but now, parameter object should have a description, and summaries should be uppercase and start with a dot. There's a lot more rules that have started to come through now because we've enabled all. So we can have a bit of control over what rules we have and what things we care about. And like I said, this is like technically invalid, but some rules allow it. So maybe we could just say whatever, we don't care about that, and we'll add it to our inherited rules list. And what that's doing is saving you from typing out a whole bunch of stuff over here. You can change the settings in YAML. You can say we want it, but it should be a warning, or it should be an error. Right, and it's the same as clicking all these things over here. But we're going to say, you know what, go away, which is the same as off. And there's a few others that we might want to get rid of. Let's try getting rid of, what's the one we were looking at? It was OpenAPI operation tags, that was it. We're going to say, for now, we don't care about these. And beyond just turning things on and off, let's have a look at how much clearer that looks. That's a little better. Still complaining about a bunch of things. Let's try and get this down, and we can look at making custom rules. So we're going to go with recommended. We can be perfect later when our things are better. And the other one was, it's an error. Thank you for telling me. I did it again. All right. So now it should be a few, right, there's a few fewer things. So we can say operation ID, let's go and up one of these. Right, we can put this in all the places. And if we do that, I think it should actually complain that they should be unique. Yeah, there we go. Each one's meant to be unique, so it's something else. So if you want to start giving them useful operation names, this would look like create payment. Sometimes people just do like a kebab case version of the title or whatever else. Let's go and put this in. Come on. What's this one? We'll call it start transaction. I won't do all of these. We can just have a few errors floating around in there. But what's more useful is that we can have, we can write our own custom rules that are not just turning things on and off, but like fully different. I started collecting a whole bunch of them over here on a project I've just started up today, which is the OpenAPI Community Style Guide. And this is going to be a general repository where we collect a bunch of ideas in for custom rules. Some of these came from users, and this is a good way for us to find out like what rules we should have by default and what rules people don't like, and make up some cool ones. So this, for example, is a succinct summary, and it basically says the operation summary should be, short, no full stops at the end. And this is a JSON pointer. This one looks a little kooky, but it's to avoid triggering the general paths one. So maybe don't worry about that too much if you aren't familiar with JSON path. But basically, when you've used JSON path to fetch the right subset of the document, you can then start applying rules. So you can say the summary field should not match, shouldn't have a full stop at the end or anywhere in it. Maybe this one will be more nice to look at. We can say schema names must be written in Pascal case. So if we were to add this rule, then you should see it pop up here in custom rules. We can go into here and say, look at our models. We're to make a new model, which is nonsense case. Then just copy this one. It doesn't work. Oh, this is okay. This is an OpenAPI 2 file, and it's so definitions, nonsense properties. So we go back to our files. If I did it on an OpenAPI 3 file, that would have been fine. So what you can do here is register them to specific formats. So the formats we support by default, OAS2 and OAS3. You can say OAS2.
And the given.
Oh, yeah. So I'll paste this one in and this one. So OAS3. So this one changes. What's it? Definitions. It's just that, right? So hopefully.
Yeah.
There we go. Nonsense case is not Pascal case, and must match the pattern. So yeah, you can do all sorts of custom things, and there's a bunch of other rules I could demonstrate. But one of the coolest things, if we want to get all these rules included, is we can extend from other things. So, not that URL. Pretend this isn't a random GitHub repo, and pretend this is like yourcompany.com/style guide or spectral.yaml. You can share things by URL and just include the URL like this. So it doesn't have to be a local file. You can have YAML files or JSON files on the internet, and you can just have your overrides in here. So we're still turning off those things, but we're saying, give me all of those fancy rules. When we go back over here, we've still got nonsense case, and we've got that succinct rule I mentioned, and we've got everything else, and they're all being pulled down from online. And the really cool thing about this is that it means you don't have to copy and paste all these Spectral YAML files around. It means you can have one style guide at your company, and then you just reference it. And then if you're having a bit of a rough time, you can turn some things off for now, and then turn them back on later, and basically share a company-wide style guide. There are plans to, make it so that you don't even need to do this. You can just have them enforced once you're logged in. But for now, I think this is a pretty convenient way of sharing rules. And what this generally means is that you don't have to have somebody whose entire job it is to like check PRs. I've done that job, and it's not fun. Like, I was the only person that knew the style guide because the style guide was like a Word document or it's on a wiki somewhere. And then every single time somebody wants to change OpenAPI, you have to go and say like, oh, those properties should be, camel case or whatever it is, because it can be really hard to remember all of the rules you read in a wiki, and maybe you didn't even know the wiki existed. The other benefit here is that because we're using this spectral.yaml, if you run spectral on the command line inside your repo, this is the place that it looks for the rule set. And so if you run spectral on continuous integration or locally, then you have all the same rules being enforced in like your PR builds as you do in the editor. So you know for a fact that people are building style guides that conform to the styles. I think it'd be really interesting to create other rules, like you check the response headers and say, okay, I can see that you're using XML here. We don't allow XML at this company or whatever. Or even say things like, we see that you have application/JSON, but you don't have the JSON API specific header, you know, or like or HAL or Siren or whichever format it is you want to use. So through this, you can actually enforce which content types are being used as well.
Phil, sorry, maybe 30 seconds on what Spectral is and like, you know, where it is, just because I don't know if everybody attended the Spectral webinar.
Absolutely. So Spectral is a open source tool that we released, which powers that validation and linting in Studio is able to use. You can play around with it here online. You can't mess with custom rules, but you get the default ones. And it's a fully open source GitHub repo. So come on over and click star and watch and all those good things. And you can use it on the command line just like this, and it will work, you know, give you pretty much the exact same stuff in a bit of a nicer format. There's a JUnit format for using it on continuous integration. And your custom rule sets that you define in that .spectral.yaml will work in here in exactly the same way. So that is that. I wasn't looking at the questions or the chat while I was doing that, so let me know if I'm missing anything.
You're good.
So moving on from linting, the other thing is you want to make sure that people are, I mean, linting's a bit tricky. If you tell somebody like, oh, this URL should have had a plural, you know, collection should be plural after they've already built it, that's a bit of a pain in the backside because you have to go back and actually, you know, if you're kind of writing these files after you've built the API, you now need to change your API in order to conform to the rules. So if you can catch people super early on, then they're building things that are a bit more realistic. And so you can build these nice, consistent APIs, but then you want to start sharing them with people and getting feedback. And so another tool that's built in down here is Prism, which is the open source tool that handles our mocking. So you might have seen this even if you haven't played with Studio. It's been around for a long time as a Go tool, and that was version 2. And we recently released version 3, which is TypeScript or JavaScript, and it works on the CLI. And again, it's a pretty cool mocking tool that you can use that's built right into Studio, or you can use it by itself, up to you. When you are working in pretty much any API, you'll have this little mock server icon down at the bottom, and this will spin up an actual server that you can use. So I can go to this, and it will show me. Oh, doesn't have a get method defined. I clicked on the wrong thing. Yeah, so these are all a bunch of posts. So what I'm going to do is switch across to a different one, just to give you a more realistic thing. So we're back to to-dos, which is a bit more familiar from Mark's demo. Now we see a bunch of these. There's a pull request open currently to add like a realistic example in there, which I'm really excited about. So you don't have to like figure it out yourself. But if you open up this, for example, then there you go. You have a mock in your browser. The mocks start off pretty simple, but to show you how things work, I'm going to start up the mock server on the CLI. You can do it all through Studio, but it's a little nicer to demo, kind of like this. So again, you get all the things. There are many questions coming in. There's many chats. Mark, let me know if I need to answer anything. So
yeah,
give you a port to listen on.
We'll handle them at the end of the. So Chris will have to go quickly, and then we'll handle some questions at the end.
Okay, yeah, I'm pretty much done here. So using your favorite CLI tool, you can basically do gets and get the data back. There we go. And beyond just doing basic gets, you'll get, this is a static mock, and then a static mock just means it's always going to be the same thing every time. It's not always the most interesting. There's a dynamic mock, which you can use to give you like random data, and this actually uses Faker and JSON schema Faker in the background to generate kind of random stuff and random amounts of stuff too. So you're not always working with the same tiny little bit of data, and this will help people that are building their UI figure out like what sort of data might come through, and if something is optional and they've built it to only ever expect it to always be a string, then this will help them identify that issue at that point. Beyond gets, there is, let's have a look at post. So I'm just doing it the shortcut way. You can fire stuff at it and you actually get errors back. This error, comically, is because no body was sent. So we're sending the JSON flag. We're going to send new task. Right. So send that, but oh, we're not authorized. Thanks for letting me know. Over here, Prism is always explaining why it's making its decisions. So if you're ever not sure why something comes back, then you'll know. And if you were to go and check the documentation, you would see that this post endpoint is actually authenticated with API key. So we can type API key 123. Any key is fine because Prism doesn't keep a store of your keys. It's just, you know, looking to see that you have the right type of key in place. So if it's OAuth2 or bearer token or whatever it is in a header, wherever, that will just do it. So we've got our name, and we want to send. Here we're getting an error from JSON. We're getting a JSON problems error from Prism, saying that we should have sent the completed equals false, or probably 0. Who knows? Oh, it is actually false. There we go. I've created a new thing. So it's not just gets, it's pretty much anything. You can test your integration with an API before it even exists and get pretty close to things being correct. You get realistic validation, realistic security checks. And that means you can build better clients before actual code exists. Now over to Chris for docs and things.
All right, thanks, Phil. Chris, Phil and I hogged all the time, so you got, I don't know, maybe 7 minutes. So you'll have to kind of cut it a little short so that we have a little time for the roadmap and Q&A stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just breeze right through it. So I guess I'll be demoing docs and publishing from Studio Web. As you guys saw in the last two demos, Mark and Phil were demoing the Studio Desktop, but we also have the full support for the desktop app and the web, minus reading and writing from files. So today I've put together a little Giphy search API. It's just hitting the Giphy search endpoints here. You can see our HTTP operation documentation over here on the right side, and then the form-based editor that Mark showed you earlier on the left. But let's go and show you some textual docs. So we'll add a markdown article here. We'll just call it Giphy search. As you can see, the title is what's shown in the sidebar over here. And we'll just start off with a little paragraph. We'll say the Giphy search provides animated stickers. Stickers called GIFs. All right, and the Giphy search API requires an API token. So we'll probably want to call that out at the top of our docs. So we'll use a little block quote and we'll just call it out. But to give this a little bit of enhancement, we can add a little theme to it. And to add a theme, we have some special syntax using HTML comments, like so. And you can just say theme, danger. So make it nice and red and nice and called out. And if we wanted to add a link, you can add a link here. It's the same markdown syntax if you're familiar with it, or you can use our markdown toolbar buttons up here, which just make it easier to add different markdown features. So we'll just say where to grab your API key from giphy.com, and then we'll move on. So the next thing we'll probably want to add is to show the users how to create a request. So we don't yet have support for embedding the request maker, but this is a feature we'll be working on soon. We'll talk about that at the end in the roadmap section. But for now, we'll just add a little code block for bash, and we'll just say it's a curl. Just create a curl to get the API. One, gifts, search. And it takes a query parameter, like we saw in the last slide over here, I think. Yep, let's just copy this for the sake of time. So go back to docs, write our curl in here, and we'll just put our API key as XXX. Next, we'll probably want to add a response. And one of the cool things, we'll probably want to add both a response example and a response schema. One of the cool things we can do with our enhanced markdown is add tabs. To add tabs, it's the same syntax as we showed before with theme. It's just an HTML comment where the type is tab. And it also takes a title, which is the title of the tag, or title of the tab. And before the tab will show up, we need to tell the markdown renderer when the tab should end. And to do that, we just add a type tab end. As you can see, our tab shows up here in the read view. And so for our example, we'll just go copy the one from our docs over here. Just copy the application JSON response, and we can just paste it in here. So this shows adding a code block, which is an example of the request that we would send in a tab. Now let's add another tab to show off the schema. So we'll just copy the first tab from before and call it schema. Add another code block, and this one will be YAML. And let's just go copy the model for the response here, the response body. So we'll switch over to the code view. We'll go to the 200 response here, and we'll just copy this whole model. We'll move back to docs. We'll just format it to be correct. And then we'll switch over to the schema tab. And as you can see, the YAML is formatted nicely here in a code block. And to go one step further, if we add some metadata to this code block, we can render the JSON schema viewer directly in the markdown. And you can do that by just adding the JSON schema metadata. And as you can see, now it's rendered nicely as the JSON schema viewer. So this is just an example of how to add some quick, nice enhanced markdown in your documentation. You can go to full screen here. You can see that we have a little on this page feature. And now I'll show you how to publish from the web. But first we'll need to commit it. We'll say add Giphy search example docs. And we'll push that up to our Git repository. Okay. Then we'll click publish. And we're taken to the publish preview. And as you can see down here in the bottom right, it tells us I've already published this API. So we only have one edition. If we look at the changelog, we can see that our article is added here. And we can click on it. We can see a nice preview. You can see our search endpoint here. See the try it out. And everything looks good. So we'll click publish. Once everything's published, we can click view the docs. And they're here for everyone to see. You guys can go and see these right now if you want. And all of our docs are here. And that's it. Mark?
All right, Chris, thank you. Yep, I will take over. We'll talk briefly about the roadmap. There's a lot of questions about next, so we'll touch on that. And then go into a quick Q&A. Let me see if I can switch screens here. All right, okay. All right. Okay, so just taking a look at the last slide here. We have a new public roadmap that you can see over at stoplight.io/p/roadmap. It looks something like this. You can see some of the stuff that's under consideration, some of the other specification types. You can submit ideas, you can indicate what's important and answer a couple questions to help shape this roadmap. You can see what we have planned and what we've recently launched. We also have the more tactical issues. So plenty of bugs, plenty of feature requests in the Studio repository. Not that specific issue, obviously, but just in Studio/issues. Feel free to submit things that you find there as well. The roadmap is much more kind of epic level, so kind of big features. So some of the stuff that's on our immediate horizon over the next couple of months is improved stability and performance for Studio. It's very complicated. It's a new release, so there's plenty of improvements there for us to make. Sharing read-only URL of your Studio project is a very highly requested feature, so we'll begin work on that shortly. Making the directory structure flexible. We realize that a lot of times you already have repositories at your organization that you want to add things to, or that already have OpenAPI files or Markdown files, etc. And it's not always easy to change those structures, so we'll be working on this very shortly. Hubs version 2. So what Chris just showed was our kind of basic free documentation. It's not nearly as flexible as Hubs, but it is a really good way to get going quickly with documentation for, in particular, internal services that might not need to be custom branded with custom domains and completely flexible structure and multiple sections, etc. But we are underway on the version 2 of our Hubs product that will be built around some of the newer stuff and have a migration path from Hubs 1 to Hubs 2. Publishing from Studio Desktop is important. We're working on that. And I think a lot of the questions around Next versus platform, it really depends on your feature set. I would encourage you to talk with sales, if you're not already, on your particular needs and timeline. We are prioritizing a really deep integration with Stoplight Next and the new platform so that they work seamlessly together. But that won't be ready until towards either December or early next year. So it won't be ready for another couple of months. But this is very much on our minds, and we do intend to integrate the two so that they can be used together seamlessly. So I encourage you to take a look at the roadmap, and if you have any issues, take a look at the Studio public repository, where there are plenty of feature requests and other things, and you can contribute there if you find things as you use Studio. So with that and 4 minutes left, let's take a look at some of the Q&A and see if we can answer a couple of these questions. All right. So we'll kind of go through, at a really high level, and if it is applicable to you, Phil or Chris, I'll just call you out since we don't have very much time here. So is the ability to add an operation ID via the form editor on the roadmap for future release? In fact, yes, that will be out in the release tomorrow. So for David, editing the operation ID in the form editor of Studio will be included in the release tomorrow. It sounds like so this is for Phil. It sounds like it's possible to run lint checks on git pre-commit. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Husky is a popular print hook thing, git hook tool, but yeah, you can just run Spectral in the CLI, and it will. If you use Husky to set it up, then it will work.
All right. And by the way, for any questions that we don't get to right now, we'll follow up with you guys with some answers because we won't be able to get to. There's quite a few questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. Here's another one. If you don't have a custom rule set defined on a Spectral YAML file, does Stoplight Studio use the recommended rule set or the all set of rules by default? I can answer that one. Studio will use the recommended rule set by default. So if you want the more strict all set of rules, you'll need to create a custom, a Spectral config file in the project and extend the all rule set. Okay, is there a way to extend the mocking server with custom steps like the scenarios in Stoplight Next? I'll let Phil speak a little to that. I don't believe that we have custom business logic or Java scripting in the mock server right now. But Phil, if you want to speak a little bit to that, feel free to, or we can move on to the next question.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely on the roadmap. We were focusing on being a super simplistic, accurate, like spec compliant mock server. A lot of the mock servers out there can completely ignore half of the OpenAPI keywords, and there's There's a lot of them. So we stuck to static and dynamic, which I demonstrated a little bit, and we're adding in kind of extension support, and then kind of we're going to look into allowing people to kind of register their own middlewares to wrap, and that will provide the custom functionality. So you can look out for certain incoming parameters, and then kind of rewrite things or respond in a certain way. That's definitely on the roadmap. It's on the to-do list on the GitHub repo. So if you go to github.com/stoplight.io/prism, you can see loads of issues and all the things we're planning on working on.
One for you, Chris. Is there a plan to share JSON examples and JSON schemas between the OpenAPI specifications and the documentation, i.e. not, copying the JSON, maybe using a ref, essentially, something like a ref inside of the docs?
Yep, this is on our planned roadmap. So yes, you'll have the ability to reference code samples from, say, like a JSON file, JavaScript file, and embed them directly into Markdown using a reference syntax.
In fact, there might actually even be a PR open for that. So that might be like a very short-term roadmap. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, it's on our short-term roadmap.
Okay. Let's see here. General questions. What is Studio's pricing model? Currently, it's free, but probably not forever. That is a great question. What you're using now in Studio is and will be free. While I can't say forever until the end of time, we have no plans to charge for the base Studio that everybody is using today. We will be, on the pricing model side, we are looking at charging for things like collaboration and hosted mocking, shared style guides, kind of some of the more platformy web, hosted on the web stuff. Still the branded public documentation, i.e. hubs, that sort of thing will remain priced. But the base designer that we've just released, the intention is to basically give that to the community to try to empower more folks to produce more API designs, because we think it's really important and we want to help move the industry forward. Is Stoplight Studio meant as a replacement for Next? Will these two coexist and both stay under active development? So yes, they currently coexist together. Studio is under heavier development than Next. That is not to say that we are ignoring Next. Next still is getting releases, I think, at least once a month. The intention over time is to, as I mentioned before, merge the two so that both Studio and Next can coexist. And then we will slowly be migrating, i.e. with Hubs version 2 or Scenarios version 2 in 2020, we'll be migrating those pieces over to the new architecture that has much better support for Git and multiple files in your local file system and all sorts of really cool things, and more specifications like OpenAPI 3 or standalone JSON schema models. Is there a migration path available from Next to Studio? Not yet, but that again is on our immediate roadmap for kind of to complete by the end of the year. Okay, there's another 20 questions here. We will answer them offline and send you guys those answers. We'll also be providing the recording for this later today or tomorrow. And I just wanted to thank everybody for the first, for attending the first Studio webinar here. We'll continue these on various pieces of our ecosystem, from Spectral to Prism to Studio to some of the newer stuff like design libraries that we're working with various companies over the coming months. And we'll do some more advanced sessions as well to look at some of the really cool advanced things you can do inside of OpenAPI and inside of Studio. And again, just thank you everybody, and we'll send this out today or tomorrow. All right, thanks Chris and Phil. Bye-bye all.
See you folks.